I stayed longer at the party. What my boss said changed my heart. One quiet sentence, a truth between clinking glasses and low laughter, shifted everything I'd been telling myself about second chances. Tonight, I'll tell you exactly how it happened. Before we begin, tell me which cities are you watching us from tonight? Drop your city in the comments. It makes me feel less like I'm talking into the dark, and more like I'm talking to a room full of old friends. I didn't plan to stay. I told myself that over and over as I smoothed the fabric of my dress and glanced at my phone. It was late spring, the kind of evening where the air still remembers the chill of winter but refuses to be anything but soft. The office had rented a small wood-paneled room above a familiar piano bar. Low lights framed black and white photographs on the walls, the smell of orange peel, and caramelized onions coming from the kitchen. Colleagues laughed in groups and someone had requested an old standard from the pianist, the sort of song that sits in your chest like a memory. I'm Ava. I'm 45 and for most of the last 5 years, I had been telling myself I was fine on my own. Work kept me sharp. My calendar kept me busy. But there's a certain hour after the cappuccinos and after the emails stop pinging when even the busiest life has to make room for the private questions. That night I had one too many of those questions. Daniel, my boss, surprised me by staying late as well. Daniel had always been the kind of leader you notice, not loud, not theatrical. I'd say his presence was a steadying one, like a book you can trust to be on the right shelf. He's careful with words, precise. He notices little things about people, the way someone stirs their drink or avoids the dance floor. Because of that, he also saw me, or at least I felt that he did, in ways that left me softly exposed and oddly relieved. We had shared polite conversation across meeting tables for years, quarterly updates, performance reviews, the kind of professional talk that keeps you both protected. He'd always been respectful, professional, never crossing lines. Maybe that was what made the night feel safe enough for something different to happen. Maybe that was what made me linger. I moved through pockets of people, said hello, hugged the friend who'd been at my side in the early days when I first moved cities, and needed someone to tell me the best dry cleaner. The party thinned as the clock nudged midnight. A few of us drifted to the back terrace for air. The terrace looked out over a quiet block. A street lamp painted the cobblestones a tired gold. Daniel was there with his drink, leaning on the railing watching the lights. Still here? He asked when I joined him, and there was no surprise in his voice, only that comfortable note that made me feel like I was being welcomed into something less formal. Yes, I said. I couldn't quite leave the music. He smiled, and for a moment the years of PowerPoint slides and staff meetings fell away. It's a good night for listening, he said. We talked at first about small, harmless things. The pianist's mistake on bar 5, the new intern's energy, a project that had landed without drama. But the silence of the terrace invites different kinds of conversation. The kind where small talk peels back layer by layer until you're looking at the bare patterns underneath. Sometimes I forget how much work relationships carry the weight of our private lives. For a while I thought my life in my office could be 2 neat boxes. That's not how it turns out. People slip between them. A laugh from lunch can tug a string in the evening. Daniel and I had over the years shared the kind of glances and gentle jokes that build trust. I trusted him. I trusted that he respected me. He told a story about his father, something small and human. The way he taught Daniel to straighten the picture frames in the hallway. The memory was tender. It was also a map of who Daniel had been. I found myself telling him in a voice that surprised me for its quietness about the afternoon I'd spent sorting through boxes of things after my divorce. The old photographs with the corners softened by fingers I no longer recognized. When I spoke, something in the air changed. It wasn't dramatic. It was the soft rearranging of 2 people making space for honesty. You carry a lot of grace, he said suddenly. It was an observation, not a compliment tossed for show. There was thought in it, like he'd been cataloging small facts about me, and then reached a conclusion. My stomach tightened because grace was not something I felt I owned. I felt more like I'd been practicing the shape of it, hoping it would fit. Grace? I asked, trying to laugh it off. I felt oddly self-conscious and yet lighter for the admission of the story. I'm more like a person who misplaces the measure cup and pretends it was on purpose. He laughed, but he didn't let the moment evaporate. You know what I mean? He said, you show up. You notice. I've watched people come and go from this company, and you listen in a way most of us don't. There was something else in his look then, not just recognition but attention. The difference between being seen and being observed. It felt intimate and safe. There was no rush, no sudden movement. The terrace seemed as if it held its breath with us. I noticed the way his hand rested on the railing, relaxed, not possessive. I noticed his shoulders had the quiet slope of someone who'd learned how to carry responsibility without making a performance of it. I told him about my mother's garden, and the way as a child I would hide under the hydrangeas to read. I told him about the small practical victories I celebrated, like finally mastering a risotto that didn't stick to the pan. He shared too something softer, a confession about how, despite the trappings of success, he sometimes felt unmet, like an actor who had learned all the lines, but forgot why the scene mattered. There was a hush between us. This is the kind of conversation that doesn't feel like a flirtation so much as an exchange of truths. Two people mature enough to hold them. Then he said something I never expected. He leaned forward a fraction and said, "Ava, I want to tell you something I should have said a long time ago. Only I didn't know how. You make the ordinary feel important. That's rare." I felt my pulse in my throat. It was not a dramatic declaration. There were no fireworks, no cinematic sweeping gesture. It was a measured, honest observation, and it felt like a hand held out in the dark. It changed my heart not because it was breathtaking, but because it was true, and because it arrived without pressure. I laughed, a thin, surprised sound. "That's the nicest thing anyone said to me in a while," I admitted. "I think I've been telling myself I don't need that kind of noticing anymore, that I've carved a life clean enough it doesn't require new cracks." He watched me with a softness that didn't try to fix me or make me smaller. "Noticing isn't the same as needing," he said. "It's about bearing witness. Sometimes bearing witness is all a person asks for." There was a pause long enough for the song inside the bar to end, and the applause to ripple faintly through the glass. I felt 100 small choices fold in on themselves, leave and keep things as they were, or step into something new with eyes open. The fact that Daniel was my boss hovered at the edge of every thought. The reality of our positions like a third person in the conversation. I am not naive about the complications that brings. But in that moment what he offered was clarity and respect. He did not move in a way that would shame me or place me in a position I hadn't chosen. "I'm not sure what this is," I said honestly. "And I don't want to rush anything. I don't want to risk the respect between us for something I can't name." "That's fair," he replied. "I would never ask you to choose the company over yourself or yourself over your peace. If anything changes, we do it the right way." But I couldn't leave without being honest. The honesty itself was a gift. I felt the tightness in my chest unwind slightly, as if an unseen seam had been gently pulled into place. I thought of my life, the routines that had comforted me, the small rebellions I allowed myself on a Tuesday night. I thought of mornings when the house felt too empty, and evenings when the silence was too loud. For the first time in a long time, I felt the possibility of someone seeing that, offering their hand not to possess but to accompany. We stood there, watching the city's dim lights like a map of other people's stories. And when he reached out, it was to tuck a stray curl behind my ear. A small tender gesture. I didn't step back. I didn't step forward. I let him do it. It felt consensual in the truest sense, simple, voluntary, and respectful. We went back inside slower than we'd left, and the party looked the same as when we'd first arrived. The pianist had switched to a ballad. A group of younger colleagues were planning a late supper. Someone bumped into a chair and apologized with a grin. But something inside me had shifted. Not because of a grand confession, but because an adult man, a man I respected and who respected me, had chosen to speak clearly and to leave me room to answer. I walked home that night under a sky that had lost the last of its blue. My head was full of small images, the way the street lamp had painted the terrace, Daniel's careful way of saying my name, the soft click of a glass somewhere in the building behind me. My heart felt different, not wildly changed but steadier, as if a door I'd kept closed had been nudged, and I'd found a little more light on the other side. I slept with a tenderness that felt almost sacramental, as if honesty itself had been a kind of prayer answered. And when I woke, the world was the same, but my place in it felt slightly more possible. There's more to tell. There always is. But for now I'll leave you with this. Sometimes the most unexpected moments aren't about fireworks and sudden changes. They are about being recognized, spoken to with truth, and allowed to keep your dignity. If you're my age, You know that a late-night conversation can be the beginning of something that matters precisely because it's handled with care. If you're watching from my city or across the country, tell me what's one small thing someone once said to you that changed the way you saw yourself. I'll read the comments, and when you're ready, I'll tell you what happened next. The morning after the party, I woke with a curious mix of anticipation and calm. The city outside my window was just stirring. Early traffic, the distant wail of a bus, a dog barking somewhere 2 blocks away. I made coffee, the smell grounding me, and thought about Daniel. I thought about how rare it was to encounter someone whose words could reach you without demanding anything in return. The memory of his quiet honesty on the terrace lingered, not like a temptation, but like an invitation to explore, to reflect, to be open. Work that day was busier than usual. Reports, emails, phone calls, the usual chaos. But underneath it all, a subtle warmth colored my mood. I noticed how colleagues' voices sounded a bit sharper. Or maybe it was just me feeling differently, noticing differently. I found myself smiling at small things, the way a document lined up perfectly, or the way sunlight caught the edge of my office blinds. There was a lightness, a sense that the world had made room for something personal and profound. Later that afternoon, Daniel appeared at my office door. He knocked gently, and when I looked up, he was holding 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might need a refill," he said. His tone was casual, but I caught that same steady attentiveness I'd felt on the terrace. He stepped inside, careful to respect my space. "Thanks," I said, taking the cup. Our fingers brushed, brief and intentional. The contact was simple, but it carried the same quiet intimacy as the night before. We sat across from each other, talking at first about routine things, deadlines, client notes, a conference coming up. And yet there was a different rhythm to our conversation. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't competitive. It was more about listening, about the quiet exchange of ideas and small truths. Then he said something that made me pause. "Ava, last night I realized how much I've underestimated the depth of our conversations. Not just about work, but about life." I felt my chest tighten. That familiar flutter of awareness that comes with being truly seen. I felt the same, I admitted. It's rare to find someone you can speak to and not worry about the shapes your words make or the gaps they leave. He nodded, leaning back in his chair, relaxed but deliberate. "I don't want to overstep, but I also don't want to ignore this. Whatever this is between us, it deserves clarity." Clarity. The word hung between us, gentle but firm. I appreciated his honesty. At 45, I had learned to navigate relationships carefully, to weigh feelings against practicality, desire against reason. And yet, here was a man who was both respectful and courageous, who recognized the stakes and still chose to be open. "I don't know what to call it yet," I said softly. "I only know that I want to explore it carefully, thoughtfully. I don't want to ruin what we already have, and I don't want to pretend this isn't meaningful." He smiled, that steady, reassuring smile that had anchored me before. "Then let's take it slowly," he said. "We'll see where it leads, with honesty without pressure. I respect you too much to do otherwise." The days that followed were filled with small, remarkable moments. Lunches together where conversation drifted easily from work to childhood memories to favorite novels and music. Emails that carried warmth without formality. Little acknowledgments that made me feel seen. I noticed how his presence calmed me, how he could make even a stressful project feel manageable. And I realized that I was discovering a version of companionship I had long thought unavailable, one rooted in respect, patience, and mutual understanding. One evening, a week after the party, we found ourselves walking through a quiet neighborhood park. Spring was fully arrived, the scent of lilacs mingling with freshly cut grass, the sky painted with soft strokes of peach and lavender. We walked side by side, our shoulders occasionally brushing. There was no rush, no unspoken expectation beyond the pleasure of sharing the moment. "I've been thinking about last night," I said, "about what you said about noticing. I've lived so long thinking that the small gestures didn't matter, that only big moments changed things. But I see now how wrong I was." He glanced at me, his expression open and thoughtful. "It's the accumulation of small truths that forms the deepest connection. Not the grand gestures, but the little acknowledgments, the genuine presence." I felt a warmth in my chest, a mixture of relief and anticipation. "I want that," I admitted. "I want to continue discovering without fear or pretense." "And I want that too," he said, "for us on our terms. The following weeks continued with this quiet unfolding. There was laughter in our shared coffee breaks, on hurried walks during lunch, conversations that stretched into the evening over phone calls or messages. Each interaction was a thread weaving something strong and subtle. I noticed how he paid attention not just to what I said, but to the spaces between my words, my hesitations, my silences, my unspoken thoughts, and in turn I observed him with the same care, appreciating the layers beneath his composed exterior. One afternoon I found myself in his office discussing a challenging client proposal. He watched me intently, giving feedback with both precision and encouragement. When I stood to leave, he said softly, "Ava, thank you for trusting me. Not just with work, but with yourself." The words hit me differently than any romantic flourish could. There was weight in them, a respect that felt like safety. I nodded, unsure if I could articulate the gratitude swelling in me. "I trust you," I finally said. He smiled, that quiet, steady smile again, and it felt like a seal of understanding. No grand gestures, no pressure, just recognition and reciprocity. Months passed, and what had begun as a hesitant, late-night conversation blossomed into a connection defined by honesty, respect, and mutual care. We shared quiet dinners, walks in the park, long talks about family, dreams, and fears. There were moments of tension naturally, differences in opinion, professional boundaries, but they were navigated with patience and understanding. I often reflected on that night, the night I stayed longer at the party. It wasn't the moment itself that mattered most, but the trust it sparked. It taught me that emotional intimacy doesn't require drama or grand confessions. It requires presence, authenticity, and courage. Daniel became more than a colleague, more than a friend. He became someone with whom I could share the ordinary and the extraordinary, the mundane and the profound. Our bond grew quietly but insistently, like ivy weaving around a sturdy trellis, steady, patient, resilient, and I, Ava, found that staying a little longer, listening a little deeper, and allowing honesty to guide the way could change a life in ways I had long forgotten were possible. Now, when I look back on that night, the terrace, the city lights, and his careful, truthful words, I understand something essential. Love, trust, and connection aren't about rushing or leaping. They are about showing up fully, respecting each other's pace, and noticing the small, meaningful details that build a life worth sharing. It wasn't a story of passion at first sight or dramatic declarations. It was a story of presence, integrity, and the profound effect of being truly seen. And that, I've realized, can change.